Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Sullivan, and this is the show where we break down popular science into easily digestible and actionable information to give you the blueprint to be a high performer in your life. Today, I'm joined by TFD performance dietitian Ryan Hasell, and we are talking about the most loved and hated food in all of nutrition, carbohydrates. We want to give you guys a pretty simple rundown of what carbs actually are. There is so much misinformation about carbs, and they cop a lot of unnecessary hate from low-carb enthusiasts. So Ryan and I want to shed some light when it comes to our little carby friends. Once we finish explaining what carbs are, we're going to answer some of the questions that you guys submitted in regards to carbohydrates. Let's get to it. All right, welcome back to another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast. I'm joined by our very Mexican-looking friend, the Dojo Dietitian, aka Ryan Hasell, who is our TFD's performance dietitian. Dojo, thanks for coming back on.
Thanks, Jordy. Thanks for having me back on.
Now, today we're going to be talking all about carbohydrates. This is something that Ryan and I get asked probably about 13 million questions every single day. I don't think there goes a single day where I don't get a DM in my Instagram or one of our clients sends us a message about this. Dojo, why do you think people get so confused on carbs? What is it that about carbs that people get so confused about?
I think carbs, it's kind of one of those things. There's always that sort of battle between fat and carbs as two like sort of demonized nutrients that get thrown around. There seems to be like team fat and team carbs, and they always seem to butt heads about like which one is healthier, which one's better for performance. It's just, there's a lot of different information coming from different camps on it. So hopefully that's something that we can kind of get into the weeds on a bit today and provide a bit of clarity on.
Yeah, I think it just really comes down to a misunderstanding of what they are. Like, I think a lot of the conversations I have about carbohydrates with my clients, all of that, oh, sugar is bad. Oh, I shouldn't eat this many carbohydrates. I shouldn't eat carbs late at night. Once you understand what carbohydrates are and what function they actually have in the body, it's very obvious that a lot of that is just rubbish. And it's like when you know these things and you go, oh, okay, I understand the structure of a carbohydrate, understand what happens when I eat it, I break it down, and what happens in my blood sugars and how insulin takes it. Once you understand that, you hear people talk about, oh, sugar is so much worse, or, you know, don't eat these at this time or whatever. And you go, oh, it just doesn't really fit. It doesn't really fit in. So I think let's just go over that, and let's just go, we don't want to go too deep and give you guys a full biochemical lesson here, but we do want to get over the fundamental basic principles that will allow you to go, okay, I get this a bit more. So first and foremost, I think let's just get this out of the way. Carbohydrate foods, Dojo, just give us a quick rundown. What are a handful of high carbohydrate foods?
Yeah, so carbohydrates, there's different types of carb foods, but essentially they're all going to come from like plant foods, right? And so carbohydrates in a nutshell is like the plant's store of energy. So any part of the plant that we would normally eat for energy, so like the roots, fruit, like seeds, grains, all of that kind of stuff, that's going to be like our carb food. So that's going to be things like potatoes, rice, wheat, like just different berries and fruits, like all of that kind of stuff is going to be really high in carbohydrates.
Yeah, and I think it's important when we're talking about carbs is how do we distinguish it from fats and proteins. And again, we don't want to go down a biochemical pathway, but like Dojo said, these are derived from plants. And a lot of what people talk about when we talk about carbs is, oh, sugar, and sugar is bad. All carbohydrates are essentially sugars. When we're talking about carbohydrates, we have these little building blocks, these little hexagonal things, and they build up, and we either have simple sugars or we have complex sugars. And then when we have really simple ones, they're things that you often hear people talk about glucose, fructose, galactose, and then you join a couple of those simple ones together and you get things like sucrose, which is table sugar, or lactose, which a lot of people will be familiar with, which is the sugar in milk. And a lot of people have problems digesting that. We'll talk about why that is. But they're what we call like our simple sugars. It's just one or two of these little hexagons. They're joined together. And then when we think about our complex things, we have lots and lots of these little hexagons joined together, and they can make these huge, big chains. And they're what we find in foods like Dojo saying, like in our rice, in our potatoes, in our breads. We've got these really complex things, and our body has to break them down. And that's different from, say, fats and proteins, because the building blocks for, say, a protein is just different amino acids, all of the essential and non-essential amino acids joined in different combinations, and they make things like our muscles, and they make things like our red blood cells and other hormones and other enzymes and cells and whatever. And fats are a completely different molecule in themselves with a hydrocarbon backbone, with outgoing everything. But that's important to realize, is that the building blocks for carbohydrates are all sugars. So when people come up to you and they say, oh, sugar is terrible, it's like, well, on a technical sense, like I understand what you mean when you're talking about added sugars and refined sugars, we'll go out all that. But in a very most technical sense, all carbohydrates are sugars.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's just that misconception of thinking some are sugars and some are something else. That's like really big in confusing people. But that is really what it comes down to, is they're all sugars, and it's just the structure of those sugars and how they're all bound together that kind of changes how they interact with our body. So as you mentioned, the longer chain ones, if you think about like how carbs are actually absorbed into the body, we can only absorb them when they are in that simplest form of just like one sugar molecule or one like glucose molecule. So the longer that chain is, essentially the longer it's going to take for it to get all the links to be broken. And then only then, once those links are broken and they're in their individual form, can it actually be absorbed up into the body. So that's where we get this differentiation between the types of carbs in terms of how quickly they can be taken up into the body and used. So when you're having things that are like much more simple sugars, so as you were mentioning, some of the things that are like table sugar or honey, or even more like processed foods that are going to be really sugary, so things like sweets and like jelly beans and all of that kind of stuff, that's all going to be the really simple sugars that are just going to basically go in and be absorbed up straight away into the blood. Whereas if you're having things like your more starchy foods like potatoes and grains and that kind of stuff, where all of those chain links have to be sort of unraveled and broken down, it's really going to slow down that process of sending those sugars into the bloodstream. And it's going to have a different effect on like the availability of them for whatever you're doing.
And I think that's a point that a lot of people don't understand, is that a donut isn't necessarily bad for the fact that there's a lot of processed or unrefined carbohydrates. It's just for what a donut is volume wise and how big it is. There's just a lot of those carbohydrates in, as compared to, say, if you were having a lot of sweet potato, which is going to have a lot of fiber in there. It's going to have a lot of these complex, and it doesn't have really any of these quote unquote unrefined or added sugars. And you can eat quite a lot of it. And like calorie wise, it's not too high, but you're not going to get a huge amount of these carbohydrates. It's going to be nice and slow trickling into your system, as compared to, say, where you have a donut, eat that donut, and then all of these ready available carbohydrates, these short chain carbohydrates already there. And there's a lot of them, and they're going to, as they come through your stomach and come into your intestine, and we start absorbing them, that's going to go into our blood. And then we all know the term blood sugar levels.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the blood sugar levels, because I think that's like a pretty key part in this as well. So like, so once we actually start getting to the blood, this is where the type of carbohydrate really impacts both like how useful they're going to be, but also this is where like a lot of the health considerations come into it as well. So as you said, like once it gets into the blood, it's then obviously like blood glucose, but so blood glucose is something that's really, really important for our bodies. And it's something that our bodies maintain like quite rigorously. So they do that, like our body does this with a hormone called insulin. So it's like, if you think about it, the way that it works with carbohydrates is carbs can't really get out of the blood and into cells without the help of insulin. So insulin basically acts as like a key to the doors on our cells, if you will, to open them up and let glucose in. Now, what happens is as we eat glucose and it goes into our blood, our body kind of like recognizes the blood glucose levels changing. It'll secrete more insulin and will kind of pack that glucose away. Where this becomes difficult is we kind of have like a capacity to respond to glucose, right? So if we have really high carbohydrate foods, but they're also really quick acting, so they're getting into the blood really quickly, our blood glucose is going to spike up. Then our body's going to like kind of freak out a little bit, like, oh shit, we need to get this blood glucose down, control it, make sure it's at like a healthy range again. So it's going to kick in heaps of insulin, right? And that's going to open up all the cells, put the glucose away. That's fine. The problem is when repeatedly doing this, so if we're just having like donut across the day, you're having these repeated spikes of glucose, you get big spikes of insulin. You do that over time, you can kind of think about it as like a rusting of the locks on the cells, all right? So like eventually over time, that key is going to get less and less effective at opening up that door. And we're going to have less and less carbs from that huge spike being able to be moved into the blood. Now, glucose, like it's a really awesome molecule for energy, but it's also kind of reactive. So we don't want it to be floating around in the blood in really high amounts, right? So, and this is what happens in a disease called diabetes. So it's sort of like uncontrolled blood glucose levels. And if they're circulating at really high levels for a long amount of time, they can react with some of like the structures within your cardiovascular system. So especially things like small blood vessels, all of that, these like really smaller cells can sort of interact, or the glucose can react with them and damage them, cause inflammation, and it can actually cause like a breakdown of those blood vessels, which like in the really bad cases, like people will like lose feeling in their hands, feet, sometimes like get a bit of blindness. And this is all sort of like really downstream effects of poor blood glucose control. And this is where I think a lot of the stigma around like carbohydrates and things come from, is this idea of increased like inflammation and like poor blood glucose control. On the other side of that, if you were to have heaps of high carbohydrate foods, say you're an athlete and you've got to have like a high amount just to sustain your training and that kind of thing, but it's all coming from those slow release foods, even though it's the same amount of carbs, because of the speed that it's traveling into the blood, it's a lot easier for the body to maintain like the control of those blood glucose levels. And so we don't often see like that sort of unhealthy resistance to insulin when we're eating more of those type of foods. I do want to caveat that though, there was a question about this that came through about like, do athletes get like insulin resistance, right, from eating like all this carbohydrate that they have to stuff into their diet? And especially like if you think some athletes might need to be having a lot of these high GI or like really quick acting carbs because they don't have a lot of time between training sessions. So do they get insulin resistant? And the answer is actually no. So exercise itself we don't really understand the mechanism behind this, but there's science that shows that exercise will shuttle glucose into the cells independently of insulin. So you don't need the insulin to get the glucose in if it's going in like during exercise or is stimulated by exercise. So there's not this high dependence on that insulin, that the key to get the glucose into the cells, if you're doing heaps of exercise as well. So if you're having heaps of carbs, but you're just sitting on the couch all day, then you're going to be like at more of a risk of developing this like tolerance or resistance to insulin. But if you're actually out there exercising a lot and you're having to eat heaps of carbs to sustain that, then that risk is reduced. And so these like health risks around high carb diets for athletes are actually not really a thing. So yeah, in a sense, that kind of should help to kind of clear up that idea and remove that stigma a little bit, now that you kind of understand that mechanism and how exercise can play into it. Did you have any questions about that, Geordie? Or
yeah, I think it's a good point to make, right? And I think it's important for people to understand that, because for a lot of athletes who engage in what we call glycolytic sports or glycolytic activity, you would have heard us talk about this 1,000,001 times. When we exercise, we obviously exercise at different intensities, and the way that our body works is that at lower intensities, our body fuels that exercise predominantly with fat. So when we're going out and doing slow, easy runs or going for walks or whatever, our body is quite happy to use this really slow burning log that is fat breakdown to fuel that. As soon as our heart rate starts going up and that intensity gets higher, our body needs a faster production of energy. And the way that it's evolutionarily coped with that is by getting this glucose metabolism or breaking down carbohydrates, because it's like firecrackers compared to the big slow burning log on the fire. Because when we break down carbohydrates, it's very fast acting. We can get energy really quick. Think about it from an evolutionary sense. If we're sleeping in a cave and then a woolly mammoth or a saber-toothed tiger or whatever comes into the cave, we can't have these really slow burning energy sources. Like we need to be go. Like you need to get up, grab the kids or whatever and run, or maybe fight for saber-tooth, who knows? But you need a really fast acting system. And that's what our carbohydrates are. So as these intensities go up, our body is really good at breaking them down really fast. And like Dojo said, for athletes, we have this mechanism where we translocate what's called these GLUT4 receptors, which you don't need to know what are, but essentially they're like a cheat code to the lock that allows glucose into the cell. Essentially, the way I think about it is every time that your muscle relaxes and contracts, I think about it's like opening the door almost and then closing it. And then as you open the door, more glucose can come out. And it's really beneficial for people with diabetes or insulin resistance to do exercise because their key is a bit rusty. It doesn't work as well, but they can utilize this mechanism of doing exercise, contracting and relaxing the muscle to get that blood sugar up. And it can really be powerful for helping to control blood sugar levels. So I think what I'm getting at here is, one, you do need these carbohydrates and these short, fast-acting carbs for exercise, because if you're doing wrestling, if you're doing boxing, if you're doing CrossFit, if you're swimming like really, really aggressively, you need quick, fast energy. And the way that you get that is through these fast carbohydrates. And there's been thousands, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of studies that have confirmed when you get someone who is doing this high intensity activity and they have no carbohydrates or they don't have any carbohydrates before, and you get people who do have carbohydrates on, almost every single time to exhaustion performance is always better with the group that has carbohydrates on board, because of this mechanism, because we know that we get carbohydrates in our blood, it goes up, we've got that energy rapidly available. Our body during that high intensity exercise loves using those carbohydrates. Bang, 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 bang. That person has more available energy. So it's really good. And I think this stigma that we're talking about really comes from, okay, well, if you eat donuts all the time, you're going to keep spiking this glucose, spiking. It's not necessarily the donut that's the problem, right? It's the concentration of these short carbohydrates that are in there that are rocketing our blood sugars up. And then, like Dojo said, for some people, they're just not going out. They're not doing this exercise. And all they're doing is sitting down, eating donuts all day. So they're just constantly getting their cells to use this key to unlock. And eventually the key just goes, nah, stuff this, I can't do it. So when it comes back to bringing this right back around, if we're going, you always hear us say like carbs aren't that bad, you can eat donuts. There is a caveat. It's like, yeah, like all boring statements from dietitians, it's like incorporate it as part of a healthy diet. If you're protein pacing throughout the day, and we're not going to get into it, the importance that having good amounts of protein and fat has on blunting this blood sugar spike that you get when you eat these fast acting carbohydrates. But if you have good protein throughout the day, you're eating good amounts of fruit and vegetables, you're eating consistently every 4 hours and getting good whole grains in, yeah, you can have some donuts in there, but you're not having them at every single meal all the time throughout the day. So you're not going to be rapidly spiking these blood glucose levels. It's not the fact that the donut itself is inherently bad. It's the abuse of what is in the donut that is bad.
I think that's a perfect way of summing it up. Yeah. And like, so that's basically carbs in a nutshell there, right? So we've got the foods, we know like now, okay, it's broken down, and the speed at which it's broken down, that's going to affect our blood glucose levels. This is why our blood glucose levels are important. We don't want them to be spiking up too high, but we want to have enough that we're able to provide energy for exercise. And then now we know like the cells, they prefer carbohydrates as a fuel source when you've got to be doing that high intensity exercise. So for people asking like, are carbs essential? They are going to be essential if you're doing that kind of training.
Yeah, I think that's another good point, right? And something that a lot of people will say is like, if they're like low carb or no carb advocates, they'll just be like, well, carbs aren't essential for life, right? Like our body can, and you know what? They are probably correct. They are correct. As a matter of fact, you can get away with eating purely fat and protein, and our body has an entire system designed just to handle that, to not handle carbohydrates. But the thing is, it's a survival mechanism. You go into ketosis, it's like a long-term survival mechanism. And you learn about this in like first, second year physiology. And the caveat to it is like, yeah, this is fantastic for when we lived out on the plains of Africa or whatever, and we didn't have access to food for sometimes weeks on end. We needed this. The thing is that our body does use glucose every single day. Our brain uses up to 120, 130, 140, depending on how big your noggin is, or grams of glucose every single day just to fuel it. A lot of parts of our body are quite happy to just work on fats. Other parts of our body do need this glucose. The thing is that our body wouldn't have these systems. Like we wouldn't, if we didn't need carbohydrates or they didn't serve a really important function for our body, we just wouldn't have the systems to process and to deal it. We wouldn't have a Krebs cycle. We wouldn't have this elaborate metabolic pathways, hundreds of pathways dedicated to turning protein into carbohydrates, turning fats into carbohydrates, vice versa, turning carbs into whatever. That wouldn't exist if they weren't important for our body. So we do need them. I always say to people, yeah, you probably could get away with eating absolutely no carbohydrates and you have stinky keto breath and you'll do all this. The thing is you probably just won't be fueling your body optimally. You'll get through, like you'll absolutely get through your day and whatever, and you'll be fine. The second you want to go in and start doing any high intensity activity or any activity that's above, say, 60% of what your capacity, you're going to be on struggle street big time.
Yeah, right. Well, to be honest, I think that's a pretty good overview of carbs and kind of how they work in the body. Did you want to leave it there, Geordie, and we can pick back up for some of those questions that came through on the gram in a short minute?
Yeah, I think what we'll do is we'll leave it there because that's a quick overview. If what we will be doing in the future, and we will be going over this in the hub a lot more if you guys want to know more about this and we want to break down these certain concepts, go check out the courses we have over there because it's really interesting. I think it's important for people to understand what carbohydrates are and understand it more from just a level that, oh, okay, an apple is a carb, rice is carbs, potato is carbs. Learning the biochemistry, you don't have to be a biochemistry major, you don't have to have a degree in science to understand it, but just understanding the concepts, being able to visually see this and be like, okay, this is what these chains look like when they're all put together, and this is what the guys are talking about when these enzymes come in and they clip them. And you know, fiber is a bit different because, oh, that's what they're talking about, is that this enzyme can't get in and break down fiber because this chain is on the opposite side to what glycogen is. If you're listening to that and going, what the heck, I would highly encourage you, go and learn about this because it makes all of these things so much easier to understand. And then when you hear people say things like, oh, sugar kills, or sugar is the worst thing ever, or, you know, this does that, you think about all this and go, well, the physiology just doesn't really line up with that. And what we know from all of the evidence and all the studies, that just doesn't seem right. And like anything, like I said, the donut is bad as if the donut is abused. I know plenty of exceptionally healthy people, top athletes, best in the world at what they do, who eat chocolate every single day or eat donuts every single day. They just understand what a carbohydrate is and how to fit it in their diet and how to use it as a powerful tool for their performance. And they don't get caught up in all of that rubbish. And I think it's very easy to get caught up in all of that if you don't have this base level understanding of what carbohydrates are. So I encourage everyone, when we put all this stuff out, I would go check it out. Go check it out and learn more about it. But what we'll do is we got about 4 million questions on this Q&A about carbohydrates. The next episode, me and Dojo are going to break all of them down for you. Probably not all of them. We'll pick about 20.
Just the good ones.
All right, Dojo, let's chat then. But thanks for coming back on.
All right, thanks for having me, Geordie. Chat soon.